Hey, Bourbon Bay family. This is Steven with our sixth episode or note of Bourbon Bay Talks. And it's kind of amazing that we've already gotten about six episodes. Hope you guys have liked so far. Also, just want to thank all my fellow subscribers for following me. Really appreciate the loyalty. If you guys haven't subscribed already, please subscribe. Right down in the bottom, there is a subscribe button, so please subscribe if you guys like this channel. Leave some comments as always. Today, we are going to be discussing how whiskey is made. I noticed that over the last five videos we didn't really talk too much about how whiskey is made, how bourbon is made. I know we've talked about the history of bourbon. We've talked a little bit about how it's made, but we really haven't gone in depth to how it's made. So that's what today's episode is going to be about. It's probably going to be a little bit longer of an episode than what we usually have. But starting off, like as we always do, I got CaveHill from Rabbit Hole. As I mentioned back in my first video, this was one of the first distilleries I got to visit up there in Louisville, Kentucky, which is right outside the city. Um, just a great little distillery. Got a great story in that, and I know I'm going to pronounce his name wrong. Uh, but yeah, his name is Kevin. Um, sorry, getting my notes. But yeah, so basically it's Kevin Zima is his name, and he kind of had his passion kickstarted for bourbon and bourbon um, when he met his wife or future wife Heather. And she was originally from Louisville. Got him to get into bourbon. He was originally much of a Scotch guy, and at the time he was also a practicing psychiatrist or psychologist and psychoanalyst, and had a really good practice going on there. Um, but after a little while, he kind of was like, I need to get a hobby. I need to start something new in my life. I want to go a different direction. So his wife said, well, hey, why don't you start a distillery? And so he's like, sure, let's go do that. And his wife, thinking after saying that, was like, crap. Um, so she was like, okay, well, here we go down the rabbit hole. And that's how they got their name. And ever since, she's been kind of his ringer, really being his support, helping him learn the industry, which once he decided to make this decision, he really did a lot of research, visited many different distilleries. And unlike some other distilleries that usually kind of get started where they purchase product from one distillery, kind of source it, and then put it on the shelves to kind of get their name out there, he decided that we're going to make our own products. I think he sourced a little bit just to kind of start to get the name, but he really wanted to focus more on making his own bourbons, own whiskeys, and ryes. So he kind of did his own thing. Tried different mash bills to find out which of the flavor notes that would really fit what he wants to bring to the market. And so now we have CaveHill. He's got Derringer, High Gold, and sorry guys, I do I'm forgetting what the rye is called, but he also has a gin as well. And I do apologize about my voice, it being a little hoarse. Went to the Tampa Bay Lightning game last night, game 5 against the Islanders. An awesome game. If you missed it, 8 goals. Vasi played awesome. The whole team's just great. And hopefully we'll see what we can do in game 6. Going back up there to Uniondale. So we'll see what happens. Very excited, a little nervous, but getting back to the bourbon. So the story behind the CaveHill's name is actually CaveHill is a famous cemetery up in Louisville, Kentucky. If you're who's who, you're eventually going to be, or you're already buried up there in the CaveHill Cemetery. People like Muhammad Ali are buried there. You also have Civil War generals and many other well-known people throughout the country are in history, whether it be in acting, in the bourbon industry, politics. A lot of famous people are buried out there in this CaveHill Cemetery. Kind of an interesting little thing about that with the name. And that's kind of what's the cool thing about Rabbit Hole is each one of the bourbons is named after something special. Um, so just kind of a great little bourbon. Highly recommend it. I know you can get it in most places from ABC, Total Wine, I think Lucan's. I got my bottle at ABC Fine Wine and Spirits up there on West Hillsboro. But as we go, we always like to say, hey, join me for a drink. Again, please comment. Let me know what you guys are having. I always love to read the feedback and see what other people and how they experience bourbon. Because again, the best way to experience bourbon is the way you like it. So here, cheers, salud. And you always want to kind of go back for a second little taste. So yeah, on this one I kind of get a decent citrus notes. I get a little cherry, dry fruit, and you kind of get that caramel in there as well, the oak and that char. Mm-mm. So yeah, sorry. So yeah, you definitely get that caramel in there. Um, get the vanilla from the oak, and that's some things that we're going to talk about in today's video. Is how important certain steps are into the making of whiskey that do play a final role in how the whiskey tastes, how the bourbon tastes. Um, I mean, like a lot of the coloring that you get from bourbons do come from the wood. Because usually when the bourbon comes off straight off the still or whiskey comes off the still, it's completely white like water. Um, Hence, actually, one of the names of it is called White Dog. Uh, and yeah, you definitely get a little bit of that corn note in there as well. So, kind of let's get started and talking. So, bourbon is made up of three basic ingredients. You got your grain, and whether that is a mixture of wheat, corn, and of course for bourbon, corn is the predominant, um, rye, or barley. And it can be any mixture of that, or you can do some without. I know, like we talked about with the St. Augustine bourbon, they basically made theirs from corn, wheat, and barley. They didn't use rye in it at all, which rye usually typically gives a bourbon that nice little spicier notes that you taste, and also a little bit more of that dried fruit. So, kind of getting into the process, most distillers will usually go and they'll pick their corn from local cornfields, um, and their wheat, their rye, and they bring it into the mill. Sometimes it is done off-site. They'll have a special place where it's either done on the place, and they'll mill it, which they grind it down, and it is very actually important based on, you don't want to have it too fine or you don't want to have it too coarse, because then it could really gunk up the machinery that is used. So it's a very fine balance that you want to have your grain when it's mixed up. Um, and then basically that grain is then added into hot water, which is the next big ingredient. And you'll hear Kentucky bourbon makers, boast well a lot about their limestone filtered water, because what it does is it takes out a lot of that iron, which will turn your whiskey black. It also takes out some other impurities that would, make the whiskey or the bourbon taste a little off or funny. And then, uh, just kind of, and they use that as part of the process. And basically, what that hot water does is it helps to break down the grains, and it takes the sugars and it takes out the sugar from the grain or the starches, which is very necessary for it to start making whiskey. because then what they do is they add yeast, which is the next big ingredient. And if you talk to any distiller, just like wine, yeast is the most important and is very praetorian. Um, like a lot of distillers will actually make sure that not everybody knows what kind of strain of yeast that they're using. There's many different kinds of strains that some will give you really nice citrus flavors, some will get you caramel flavor, some will get you a little bit sweeter, some will get you a little bit more bitter or a little bit more spice. So there's definitely different proprietary strains that each distiller will make sure that they're using. And what that yeast does is it eats the sugars once they put it into the fermentation process. And kind of showing you real quick, this is out of the Complete Whiskey course, which is a great book if you want to know how whiskey is made, the history of whiskey. Definitely a great course. Book to buy and purchase. I got this one off of Amazon. You can actually go to the gift shop over at Urban Stillhouse, and they have this book in there as well. So this kind of actually has a picture showing you of the like what an original still was, probably back from like the Scottish times, way back like in the 1600s, I would assume. Um, so there's kind of showing you guys over on Twitch. Oh, and then just to let you guys know, I am also streaming over on Twitch as well. Uh, so yeah, and then here's another good little picture that kind of shows you them mixing in the water into the grains and the yeast to get that process started. And what that does is it starts the fermentation process. So like that right there. And the grains and the yeast starts breaking down those sugars, which then the byproduct of that is alcohol, ethanol, carbon dioxide. And of course, so once they get done with that fermentation process, which usually sometimes takes around 3 to 5 days, could take a little longer, could take a little shorter, just depending on what the distiller is trying to bring out of those the flavors that they're trying to bring out. And so once that process is completed, it is what's considered wort or distiller's beer. And that distiller's beer, which if you're really interested in the brewing, that's what is basically what's considered beer, and usually is around 7 to 9% alcohol, which is very critical into the distilling process. And this is where distillers kind of go a little bit further than what the brewers will do, is then after this fermentation and they get the alcohol and the beer that they want, then they put it into the distilling pots. And there's actually a couple different little pots. You have what's your traditional pot still. This was one of the first where they would put in the beer and then they would light a fire under it, and then it would vaporize the alcohol because alcohol actually has a lower boiling temperature than water does. And so what they're trying to do is they're trying to separate that water. They're trying to separate those solids that are created from the fermentation process and get out the alcohol. And then a lot of these pot stills, and now what we have more is that if you go to a lot more modern distilling companies out there, you'll see the huge column stills. Some places like St. Augustine Distillery, Old St. Pete, here in Florida, they'll actually have a hybrid of a pot and column still, and this kind of helps. It adds different flavors, or it helps them to extract different flavors out of the whiskeys than like what a column still would be. Column stills, a lot of the time, they're used for continuous distilling, where the pot stills you have to start over each process. And once it goes into the distilling, And then here's also from the Stave and Seath Society, which is where I got my executive bourbon stewardship, a great program. Again, if you want to learn more about how bourbon is made, to learn more about how to taste bourbons, great program. But this is one of their books. This is kind of some other illustrations on how that distilling process works. Um, and basically, one of the major things that they use is copper. Copper stills is a great tool. It helps distribute the heat a lot better than, let's say, other metals would have been. But two, and probably the most important, is that the copper actually has a catalyst, and during that process, it actually takes away undesirable flavors such as the sulfur, and it helps to take that away from the whiskey and helps it to taste better. So it's a great conductor. It helps to filter out more undesirable products that sometimes are byproducts of the distillation, the fermentation process. So they definitely love that copper. And if you go up to many distilleries or go in many distilleries, you'll see that a lot of those distilling equipment is made from a company called Vendome. They're actually based out of Louisville, been around for a very long time. Um, and it's just a great little um, way to basically help the distillation process. And here's actually a couple more pictures of some of those. I believe on this one you have that hybrid, like I was talking about, between the pot and the column still. And on this side you have more just the pot stills. Um, and basically during that process you get the couple different. So once that alcohol basically is vaporized, it goes up the column, and then it goes into some copper tubings, sometimes called worms, or they do have it go into that column still. And during that process, they shoot heat up through the bottom of the column stills. And as the alcohol condenses and heats each plate, you get another type of evaporation, and so it causes the alcohol to increase in proof. And it also gets any of the solids that was in the original vapors goes down to the bottom, so it purifies it more, it increases the proof more. And then once you get through all this process, you get uh, the final distilled spirit, which, like I had mentioned earlier, is called White Dog. Uh, and if you guys have any questions, please feel free to put them down in the comments. Let me know. If you want to go further into detail, we can definitely do another video about this that goes a little bit further. I know this is a lot of information. It is a pretty technical procedure, but it's also a very interesting aspect of whiskey. I mean, just to know all the different steps. And it's one of the things I learned is that each of these little processes is a different decision, and each decision eventually will affect the end product. Like what they decide to make the final proof at. I mean, if you distill it higher than 190 proof, you're basically at that point just making vodka, because that is almost pure ethanol alcohol. Um, and it's flavorless. You're stripping out all the flavor in that whiskey or that alcohol, and you're just basically getting straight up ethanol that has a really huge burn to it. Um, so it's very important, and depending on the distiller, there's many decisions that are made during these steps on what the final product will be like. And as we had mentioned earlier, for it to be considered a bourbon, it can't be distilled for higher than 160 proof. A lot of distillers will go a little bit lower than that, because they want to keep that flavor. They want to keep where you can taste the corn, where you can taste the barley notes, you can taste different aspects in each of those flavors. Um, and so once it's finally distilled, And then here's actually a great picture of what a column still looks like. And you can see like the different windows are the different plates, where then it is filtered out even more and increases the proof, increases the purity of the alcohol. Um, yeah, so basically, once you get to that final end, which most whiskeys will be coming out about 160 proof or lower, and like I said earlier, that's considered what's white dog, and that is what then goes into the barreling, or they barrel that, and from that point on, distillers basically leave that maturation process, that aging process, because this is where whiskey then gets all its coloring. This is where it gets a good majority of the flavors, and is actually considered one of the most important steps in making whiskey. Because there are so many different things, like I can make a whole video just about wood science, because the wood does play a very major role in how a final product is going to taste. And kind of one thing I did forget to talk about is usually the first run that comes off a still is what's called the head. This is probably the highest in alcohol. Definitely not going to be very flavorful, and it's actually going to be pretty deadly. This is where all the nasty, um, like, and sorry, like methanol, I think that's what it's called. That is not what you want to drink. And then there's what's called the tails. This is kind of like the last little bits that you're able to get out of a whiskey. Again, has some off notes, not one that you're really going to want to try either. But so what they do with these two is that they take these off the still and they put them aside. And then sometimes what they'll do is they'll actually rerun it again to get out the ethanol. That is the part of the alcohol that you do want to drink. Um, and that's a lot of what you'll see on bottles is what's called sour mash, is where they take the previous run of the alcohol and they put it into the new run, actually back in the fermentation stage, because what that does is it keeps more of a consistency and flavor, the heat profile. It reduces the amount of chance of any unwanted bacteria getting into the whiskey and changing the flavor, ruining the whiskey. Um, Usually, when a person or a distiller decides to go completely new, they're just starting. That's what's called a sweet mash. That's the first ever. And some distillers will do that. Well, they'll do a sweet mash, but a lot of places and a lot of distillers will do sour mashes where they keep reusing so they can keep that consistency. Um, but basically, yeah. So, kind of getting back into the part of the whiskey that most distillers shoot for is what's called the heart. This is has the most ethanol. This is the best part of the whiskey, and this is what gets put into the barrels. And then, depending on how long the distillers want to have it aged for, they can either have it age 3 years like St. Augustine does, which how they make it actually does do a very nice whiskey. I think Rabbit Hole, I believe, is about 6 years. Actually, no, this one says matured over 3 years in new charred oak barrels. So this is a 3-year-old bourbon, just like St. Augustine. Um, you will hear a lot of distillers say that the magic number for bourbon is probably between 6 to 8 years or 9 years. Just kind of depending on the seasons, how long, if it's a colder winter, or a hotter summer. It just kind of all depends. It's a very much left up to nature in that aspect. Uh, and then what's also an interesting fact is once they barrel that within that first year, about I think 12 or 15 to 20% of, and if I'm wrong, you guys can comment, let me know if it's a little higher. I think one time I heard it was about 30%, but about 30, like 15 or 30% of the whiskey is actually evaporates within that first year, and that's called what's the angel share. And then every year after that, it's a little less evaporates. So, um, yeah, you can see why some whiskeys and bourbons tend to be a lot more expensive, especially the older they get, because the longer they leave in the barrel, depending on where it is in that rick house, uh, there's the greater chance that by the time they actually get to that barrel, there's not going to be a whole lot left in it. So it sometimes can be definitely a calculation and a risk. But yeah, so I hope you guys enjoyed. And then once that aging does happen, they do the bottling. And of course, that is another important step because depending on the proof that you put that bottle or put that whiskey into the bottle, that can affect the flavor as well. So you can see how there's so many different decisions, different steps that just go into just the making of whiskey. So before you even see it on the shelf and buy it, there's so many different steps that can go in there. And if it's wrong, then ugh, it can ruin the whiskey, can ruin the flavor, or if they do a lot of great steps, you know, so there's just a lot of variables, and it makes it a very interesting um, process just to get that bottle from the field to the shelf. So I hope you guys really enjoyed this video. I know it was definitely a lot longer of a video than I usually do. And I hope you guys, if anything, just let me know if you really enjoyed this. We can definitely do more videos about this subject because, again, I only covered probably a very small amount of what actually goes into the whole process of making whiskey. So if you guys want to know more, please let me know down in the comments. Give this video a like. Again, I appreciate the follows. If you like this, please subscribe to me so we can keep doing this. And I really appreciate Stave and Thief Society, the complete course of whiskey. These were definitely great guides in helping me make up this video. So I hope you guys enjoyed. Again, please leave me some comments. If you guys learned a lot, let me know. And let me know if you guys want me to do more of these kind of videos about the science of making whiskey. Other than that, I hope you guys have a great day, or good afternoon, good evening, good morning, depending on whenever you're watching this video. And if you're going to drink, have a drink with me. And cheers and salute. Have a great day, guys. So, guys,